So welcome, my name is Céilidh Erickson, and we are discussing some critical reasoning. So I assume that you're all here because you are interested in learning more about the GMAT, learning some study skills that can help you get that top GMAT score. So what we're going to be covering today are some ways of approaching critical reasoning that might be a little bit different from what you're used to. So the approach that we're going to take is not really looking specifically at particular question types and, solving a bunch of weakened questions in a row, for example, but rather thinking holistically about how the GMAT structures these questions, and thinking about how we can find some patterns. Because really the key to being an expert GMAT test taker is pattern recognition. So I'm going to share my screen here. Our goal is pattern recognition within critical reasoning, finding logical flaws, and how the GMAT likes to recycle the same logical flaws over and over. But first, I'll introduce myself. My name is Céilidh Erickson. I've been teaching the GMAT for a very long time, since, let's say, 2011. It's been a very, very long time. And so I've taught GMAT, GRE, SAT, many other subjects. My background is educational neuroscience. So I'm really interested in the idea of how does learning happen and how can we structure learning systems that maximize the return on investment of your learning time. So very nice to virtually meet all of you. This is a webinar. I'm going to be doing most of the talking because we're a big group, but you absolutely should feel free to participate in the chat, raise your hand if you have questions. I like to have a very participatory group rather than just a lecture. So everyone in the main chat, just say hello and tell us where you're dialing in from. I'll start here. I'm dialing in from Brooklyn, New York. And today's lesson is going to be an hour. So hopefully everyone has access to that chat. All right. Have folks dialing in from all over the place. A lot in the US, a lot around the world, a couple Toronto, a couple Chicago. Nice to have you all here. So, our agenda for today, we're going to look at different types of critical reasoning questions and kind of how they fit into different categories. And then we're going to focus specifically on the types of questions that involve flawed arguments. So what we'll talk about what we mean by that. What is a flawed argument? And then our real focus is going to be investigating some common patterns in those logical flaws. So let's just dive right in. Here's how I like to think about critical reasoning. There are, as you've seen, if you've started studying for critical reasoning, a lot of different kinds of questions that they can ask, but I like to categorize them broadly into three buckets, if you will. The assumption-based ones are the ones that we're going to be talking about today. Find the assumption, weaken, strengthen, evaluate, and flaw. Whenever you have these types of arguments, that's the GMAT's way of telling you, hey, we have an opinion expressed by the author. There is some reasoning given, and then there's a conclusion drawn, but something's wrong there. These are not perfectly valid arguments, because if they were, you wouldn't be able to weaken them, or you wouldn't need to strengthen them. So we already know going into these question types that something's going to be wrong with that argument. We can contrast that with these other two broad buckets. Fact-based critical reasoning, these actually aren't arguments at all. If you see inference or draw conclusion questions, they're giving you a series of facts and asking you to extrapolate from them, but there's no real opinion expressed. These aren't actually arguments. And same with resolving a paradox. These aren't really arguments, they're just a series of facts. So we're not going to deal with those today, and we're not going to deal with the structure-based ones that ask us to just categorize what type of information we're given, identifying whether a statement was a conclusion or was a premise. Instead, we're going to be focusing on these 5 types of questions because these are the ones that involve flaws. So each of these Our task is going to be identify the missing assumption that would be needed to connect the premise to the conclusion. Now, when you get to the verbal section on critical reasoning, you're going to get 23 questions on verbal total. Somewhere between 10 to 13 of those will be critical reasoning. I can't guarantee what your breakdown is going to be. They randomize it. But if we assume that the official guides are roughly representative of what you might see, these 5 questions are about 75% of all the questions, all the critical reasoning questions in the official guides. So developing that skill of looking for logical flaws is pretty much, in my opinion, the most important skill to build in critical reasoning. So, flawed arguments. All 5 of these will involve something broken, something wrong with it. So our initial task for all of these is going to be the same. That's going to be our focus today. We're finding the missing link that would be needed to connect the premises to the conclusion. And when we say premises, what I mean here is just anything that's used in support of the conclusion that the author is drawing. So, to give you a very cheesy analogy, imagine that an argument is the author trying to build a structure, build a little house of an argument. And if we had premises and the missing assumption, then the conclusion would stand. That structure would hold up to scrutiny. But most of the time, we don't have that missing assumption, which means that the conclusion is not structurally sound, that this argument as a whole is not structurally sound. So most of these arguments need that extra, in fact, all the ones that we're looking at need that extra piece, need that missing assumption to make the whole thing stand up. Oh, I'm glad you like my cheesy visuals. I like to make myself laugh. They're very corny. So let's look at an example. And what I want to show you first is how finding that missing piece relates to all 5 of the question types that we're looking at. So we'll start with find the assumption, because this is kind of the most direct. Name that thing that's missing. So if you ever see a question that's structured something like, which of the following is assumption on which the argument depends? That word depends is really important here. The task, what we want to do is look at the premise, look at the conclusion, and then ask ourselves, what would be necessary to connect the dots? Where is there something that's not there that we would need? So I'm going to give you all an argument. And what I want you to do is start typing in the main chat, but do not hit enter yet, because I want to give everyone some time to think. And then once I say enter, you can hit enter, but give everyone some time to think about it. Let's say that in the argument, we were given the premise, a higher percentage of applicants was accepted to business school this year than last year. Therefore, our conclusion is business schools must be admitting larger classes. So I want everyone to try to think of what assumption might be missing. Start typing, but don't hit enter yet. All right, go ahead, hit enter if you know what the assumption is here. Ooh, yes. Love this. You guys are right on the money. Anyone who said something about the number, there's something off with the idea of going from percentage to going to larger classes, which is information about a number. So we'd have to assume that there were not fewer total applicants. And notice I'm being really nitpicky with my language there. Anyone who said the numbers stay the same, you're totally right on with the assumption here, but the GMAT would be very specific. There were not fewer, because there could have been more, and the argument would still hold, right? So what you want to do, here's my recommendation. My, again, cheesy thing that I like to do. When I'm trying to find what's missing in the argument, I picture the author as someone I kind of hate, as someone I think is really stupid. Maybe you have like coworker that you think has bad arguments, or someone from college who you really didn't get along with, or a politician, or I'm not going to tell you who to think about. But picture someone who you think their arguments are bad. Picture them as the author and get in that habit of fighting against the author and being like, wait, does higher percentage accepted mean larger classes? Well, no, not if there were fewer applicants. And if you get in that antagonistic mindset, it can really help you find where the argument's broken. Oh my God, I love it. Picture the author as your uncle. We won't ever tell your uncle that you said that. But yeah, fight with the author. So for find the assumption, this is what you want to do. You just want to point out this is the missing thing. And then the way that you test that, you may have read this strategy, is you can try to flip it around, negate it, and see if it ruins the argument. If we flip that assumption and said there were fewer total applicants this year, the whole argument falls apart. So that's how we approach find the assumption questions. Our approach to the other questions in this bucket are actually pretty similar. So let's imagine that it's a strengthen question. What would most support? What would help the author's argument? What, if true, would lend more credence to the argument? What you're trying to do there is add a new piece of information that supports the assumption. Listen to me here. You are not supporting the conclusion directly. You're supporting the assumption. We're not trying to say business schools definitely are admitting larger classes. That's not our goal. Our goal is to bolster the connection between premise and conclusion. So you're looking for a new piece of information that suggests that applicants did not go down. So one example of a bolstering new piece of information could be like, number of good jobs that require MBAs has increased steadily in the last few years. If that were true, it would give us more reason to believe that there weren't fewer applicants, which would then help the conclusion. But notice, this doesn't prove it, right? And we didn't need it to be true that the number of good jobs requiring MBAs has increased, right? So it is actually a different task than find the assumption. And I find that a lot of people mix these up. Strengtheners make the argument more likely, but they are not necessary to the argument. And they do not prove that the conclusion is definitely true. They just help. Assumptions have to be true. Strengtheners do not have to be true. And that's the main distinction. All right. I'll keep moving along, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or raise your hand at any time. So if that's strengthen, as you might imagine, weaken is exactly the flip side. If you're asked to cast doubt, to undermine, what you're doing is attacking the assumption, not attacking the conclusion. We are not trying to prove that business schools are not admitting larger classes, but we're trying to cast doubt on that connection about the number of applicants. So look for a new piece of information that attacks the assumption. For example, tuition prices have risen so much that many would-be applicants are deterred from applying. Doesn't guarantee that we're not admitting larger classes, but it hurts. So you're not looking to disprove, you're just looking to cast doubt on the assumption itself. Priyanka, when you're saying, can you give a numerical example? Sometimes, are you saying like a strengthen or weaken? So what I'm saying essentially is that this tuition prices have risen so much. This is what the right answer would be structured like if it were a weakened question. Sometimes they might throw actual numbers in there, sometimes not. But that essentially, if this were the setup, this would be the right answer choice that we were looking for. Evaluate questions are a little bit different, and some people find these tricky because they're asking, what would be useful to know in evaluating the argument? But if you think about it, that's just another way of saying, if we need to know something else in order to evaluate the validity of the argument, then something is missing in the argument. So we find what's missing, and then we ask a question that would give us new information about it. And what you want to look for is a question that could weaken in one direction and strengthen in the other direction. So let me give you an example of what I mean. If this is our argument and we've come up with this as our assumption, the right answer might be framed like, has concern over student loan debt caused fewer people to apply this year than last year? So this would be the answer choice, structured like a question. And what your task would be is to ask yourself, what if the answer to this question were yes? What if the answer to the question were no? So if it were yes, it weakens the assumption and thereby weakens the argument overall. But if the answer is no, it would strengthen the assumption and therefore strengthen the conclusion. So I think these ones are a little bit tricky, but it does involve the same thought process, identifying the same logical flaw. And then last on our list, find the flaw questions. These ones are structured a little bit differently. What is the logical flaw, or what constitutes the biggest flaw in the author's argument? Essentially, what they're saying is like, tell us why the author's dumb, right? Tell us why the author is stupid. Criticize this argument. And so you still do that same process of finding what's missing, but then instead of framing it as the author assumes, you would just say, there is not evidence. We assume without evidence that an increase in percentage, or that the percentage increase is not the result of a decrease in the number of applicants. So all 5 of these question types, exact same upfront thought process, exact same way of breaking down the argument, and then all that changes is how we approach the answer choices. So it can be helpful to then look for patterns across all 5 of these. Basically, the arguments that you'll see are kind of interchangeable across these 5 question types. So what we're going to look for is some patterns in logical flaws. The GMAT test writers, I mean, just like the rest of us, they get lazy sometimes and they recycle the same ideas over and over and over. Sort of like, how songwriters will recycle the same melodies and the same beats. Same thing happens on the GMAT. So if you can learn to recognize those logical flaws, you'll notice them pop up again and again and again. And if you can recognize that as a pattern, you can move through the answer choices much more quickly and more confidently. And the GMAT is definitely a time-constrained test. Any of you who've taken a practice test or taken the real thing, you know how constrained it is. Ooh, it is hard to move through quickly enough. So the more that you can do to give yourself tools to be like, it's definitely that, got it, move on, the better. So we're going to look at some sets of arguments together that have something in common. I want to start with this set of 3, the first of which we just discussed, but the other 2 have something in common as well. So take a look, just read through these for a second and get in that antagonistic mindset, try to fight with the author on each of these. So take a minute here. All right. So we said that with that first one that we just did, the assumption was we're assuming that percent is the same thing as number. In other words, that the total number of applicants didn't decline. Anyone in the main chat, what are we assuming in the second one? Or you could frame it as what's broken? What's wrong with this argument? What's the issue? You're always welcome to frame it as a what if. Ooh, okay, Jose, they sold everything. It could be about inventory. Maybe there's stuff left over, maybe there wasn't. Don't know. Any other assumptions here? Anything else that you guys think is broken? How about this? Are there any places where the premise and the conclusion are talking about two different things? Ooh, Tony, artisans produce no fewer, that those workers are not faster or more efficient, as Abrar is saying. Yes. Here, the major assumption that we're making, and I think the whole thing about like, what about inventory and what if we're importing from elsewhere, like all of that's valid as well. But the major issue here is that we're assuming fewer artisans means that they're making fewer purses themselves, so they have to be importing more. So we are mixing up number of artisans with number of purses, which means the flaw is we're not thinking about productivity. What if productivity increased? Then the whole thing would fall apart. All right, what about the last one? We're saying the average overtime in manufacturing was 17 hours, majority work in manufacturing, so most people work some overtime. Does that seem plausible? How could we fight against that argument? Outliers. Yes, that is my favorite word when it comes to anytime you see the word average on the GMAT, you should think, what about outliers? What if there are some people who are behaving totally differently from other people? Here, the mix-up that we're making is we're assuming that average represents everyone. The people are mostly behaving similarly, but what if there were outliers? What if one person did hundreds of hours of overtime and everyone else did none? So the thing that these all have in common is that they're actually math problems, not critical reasoning problems. So I like to call this idea mixed metrics. In each one, we're going from one kind of math in the premise to a different kind of math in the conclusion, and assuming that those two maths are mathing, but they're not, right? Or not necessarily. So if you see math, any kind of math language in a critical reasoning problem, try to treat it like a quant problem or like a data sufficiency problem, right? So, first pattern, a mixed metric problem is when you have an argument that talks about one metric. So could be percentage, and then we move to number. Could be average, and then we move to majority. Or it could be number of workers versus production per worker, that sort of thing. So I mean, there are other non-mathematical metrics that they might mix up, but particularly when it's math, your alarm bell should be ringing, be like, are those maths the same, right? All right. Let's try another pattern. And this is one that I bet you've heard of before. I bet you've seen talked about, but read through these three and then we'll discuss. All right. I bet that this is a familiar enough concept that even before we discuss all three of these individually, does anyone see a pattern? Cause and effect, correlation and causation. Exactly right on the money here. So this is something that the GMAT loves to do that should set off major alarm bells every time. If we're saying, oh, we noticed that when people have depression, they're drinking, therefore, drinking causes depression. What about the opposite, right? So which one's the cause? Which one's the effect? This argument is jumping to one conclusion, but we don't know why it's not the other way around. So here we're assuming that the reverse isn't true, that depression, wow, I can't spell the word depression and clearly didn't proofread it carefully enough. Depression doesn't make people more likely to drink alcohol. Okay, so that's kind of the classic. We see X and Y happening together, so X causes Y, and you want to be like, wait a minute, could Y cause X instead? What about the second one? Can anyone see how this is a cause effect or correlation causation issue? Well, so we're looking at the kind of the population of all the athletes out there, and then the athletes who are swimmers, and we see that okay, swimmers have asthma more. So we have a correlation there. Swimming, asthma correlated. But we're assuming that they start swimming and then they get asthma. Could it be the other way around? What if people start swimming because they already have asthma and they don't want to be outside, they want to be inside? We're assuming that swimming came first and caused the asthma instead of the other way around. This is a correlation and causation issue. What if people who have asthma avoid other sports? Exactly. So, I mean, there are lots of different ways that we could categorize this type of argument. You could call this like a representative sample issue or a comparison issue. Are kids with asthma like all other kids? Are they comparable to all other kids? Or are they different in lots of different ways that impact behavior? But for our purposes here, if you recognize this as a correlation causation, it can be then easy to be like, what about the flip side? And then with the last one, all right, so we've got this publicity campaign. All right, traffic went down, bus riding went up, so the campaign worked. Fight this argument for me. Why is this author stupid? What about gas prices? What about some other reason? What about you know, there could be, reasons why it's really fun to ride the bus. So, oop, sorry. If you're not on mute, go ahead and mute yourself unless you had a question to ask. So yeah, the assumption here is that just because the campaign was there, that it at the same time that it caused this change. In order to draw that conclusion, we would have to assume that nothing else was the causal factor. Gas prices, bus fares, highway construction, something else. So these are all correlation causation issues. And anytime you recognize an argument like that, essentially, you should ask yourself two questions. If you see, okay, we've got X and Y correlated with each other, and we're saying X caused Y, could Y cause X? Could some Z third factor cause both? Or I guess there's a possibility that they're completely unrelated, but that's, it's usually one of these two things, the reverse causation or an external cause. Cool. This one you guys knocked out of the park. Let's try one. This one might be a little bit more nebulous. So give this one a try. Okay, let's look at this first one. Can anyone tell us if you were fighting against this argument, any assumptions that you see here? Issues with this argument? Ooh, Carson, people weren't more inclined to report than previously. Okay, so we're talking about the reports of violence. Is that exactly the same as the actual amount of violence that's happening? So here's one thing that I want you guys to think about. Whenever you see an argument that takes place across time, 10 years ago to now, often we're assuming that only one variable has changed in those 10 years, in this case, violence, but could other variables have changed, like people's behavior? So we are assuming that people are reporting at the same rate that they used to, or in other words, that they're not more likely to report now than they were 10 years ago. There are all sorts of things that could change. Maybe there's like an easier computer form to fill out, so it's just easier for them to do it now. Maybe they have better relationships with law enforcement than they did 10 years ago. Maybe kind of cultural norms about speaking out have changed over 10 years. A lot can change about people's behavior that doesn't actually reflect the underlying condition that we're reporting. Um, yeah, could be that people were coming from the outside the city, sure. So the campaign to reduce violence, maybe it's like, well, it worked on the people who saw the campaign, but the violence is like people come in, commit violence, go home. Sure, absolutely, that could be it. So you kind of always want to ask, like, are the two populations that we're talking about in premise and in conclusion the same? Or in this case, people who are reporting and where violence is happening. I think that's totally relevant here as well. A lot of times there are multiple issues per argument. Like if we didn't have that little bit at the end that said the city's population was unchanged, then it would be then this could be a mixed metric issue where it's like, oh, number of acts of violence reported is the same, but what if there are way more people than before? So it could be a lower proportion. But in this case, we removed that possibility. How about the second one? Break this argument for me. What could be wrong with the idea of connecting the sightings of alligators to alligator population increased? It could be the same alligator. It could be one really friendly alligator who's just always out there on the golf. Could be one alligator who loves golf. Yeah. Ooh, damage of habitat. What if the alligators are just congregating more on lawns and golf courses because other circumstances have changed for them? And then the same issue with the number of reports. Just because we're seeing it, or just because we're hearing the reports. Okay, so like sightings of alligators, okay, but could it be the people's behavior changed instead of the alligators' behavior changed? Could be they're calling the hotline more than they used to. So we always want to kind of question, is the data point about the sightings of alligators the same as actual number of alligators? So it could be increase in human population meant there was just more lawns and more golf courses, fewer places for the alligators to go. Yeah, relaxed rules, people wandering. There's so many things that could change about the human environment that don't actually reflect any change in alligators at all. Nice. All right, what about this third one? Break this argument for me. People are immune. Okay, that could be the case, but then if people are immune, then there's no link between this chemical and this disease. So I think we'd want to specify, like, yeah, by a sample size, these specific 50 people happen to be immune, but it doesn't mean that everyone is. Yeah. Are these 50 people representative of everyone? We've got a sample issue, possibly. 50 people, not that much. And then, ooh, I like what Pujitha and Sierra are saying. Like, what about the time it takes? Jose's saying that as well. Like, there could be an effect that happens over time. If you immediately test for something, then the results that you're going to see might not actually indicate the prevalence of the disease itself. So yeah, love it. You guys are absolutely crushing this. We could kind of wrap it up and say we assume that the absence of positive results means that there's no correlation, but there could be all sorts of things that account for that. Could be the sample size is either insufficient, like that's just not enough people to see the effect, or it could be that these 50 people were different, unique somehow. We're assuming that there's no time issue, that the results would appear immediately. And then, I don't know, how are we, could be something faulty about the test. And then we notice that word report is kind of ringing alarm bells for us. Not a single case was reported. Maybe someone threw out the reports of positive cases, or maybe the factory workers were supposed to self-report, but they were scared to or something. So there could be something about like, is everything being reported accurately? Is this a good test? All of that. Testing could be done incorrectly, absolutely. So, um, I'm not saying never trust your sources or never trust the data. But this is an issue that will pop up a lot on the GMAT, is that you shouldn't trust all the reports that you see. And some reports you should really question. And here's kind of when we know to raise the alarm about reports. If you see self-reported data. So if it's like people filled out a survey and this many of them said that they, are happy all the time. And it's like, well, are they lying? Or maybe only the happy people filled out the surveys. So any self-reported data we should be really wary of. But also any like call-ins of alarms, of crimes, of alligator sightings. It might be indicative of people's behavior rather than the data itself. If you see instances where you think it's likely that people are motivated to put out good information but not bad information, that could be an issue as well. And then the idea of it could be an insufficient sample size or an insufficient amount of time. So the report might not indicate what we want it to indicate. I used to, when I was trying to come up with like a title for, because like correlation causation, okay, that's a concept that exists out there in the universe. There's a title already out there for that. I kind of came up with this idea of mixed metrics. And then the can't trust reports idea, people call this so many different things. I was calling it like signifier versus signified for a while. And my students are like, what does it mean? Signifier versus signified. I was like, the report doesn't always mean what it says. And I was like, I should just call it that. Um, all right. And then we've got one more pattern that we want to detect, and then we'll do a couple example problems if we have time. So try this last set, try to break each argument, and then try to think if there's a common link between them. Go for it. All right. So I think the first one is like kind of silly at face value. This isn't directly taken from a real GMAT problem, but this is actually similar to the kinds of structures of arguments that you'll see on real GMAT questions. So anyone, main chat, what's the issue with this first argument about red sports cars? I'm going to push back. I don't think it has to be true that only red sports cars are speeding, but if they're doing the most speeding, then if we get rid of the category that's at the top, we've still helped reduce speeding overall, right? So I don't think it has to be true that the other um cars aren't speeding. Angeli, yes, that people who are speeding, once red sports cars are outlawed, they're not going to just sit at home and not drive, right? And their behavior is not because of the red sports car, right? These are people who like to speed. If they can't have a red sports car and they get some other car, aren't they still going to speed? The problem here is that we're assuming that it's the car's fault and not the driver's fault. So we're kind of ignoring the human behind the behavior, and we're assuming that the mechanism of the behavior was the issue. But yeah, if we get rid of the red sports cars, those drivers are just going to turn around, get in another vehicle, and probably speed just as much. So, any argument that talks about like something that's actually there are humans doing it, but it sort of abstracts the humans from the problems, you should ask like, what are people really doing here? Um, and yeah, Fred, I think that's a great way of putting it. Like that you won't speed in other cars if you're a red sports car driver. Um, yeah. All right, what about the second one? I love Angela's way of putting it. The students will follow the plan. This is, I mean, this one's kind of sneaky, but like whenever we have an incentive, like, hey, we want you to do this thing, so we're gonna change our school day for the thing that we want you to do, which is sleep more. We're assuming that they're actually doing the thing that we want them to do, but we know teenagers. When do they ever do what we want them to do? What if they didn't change their behavior the way that we were trying to incentivize them to change their behavior? We're assuming that the plan is going to work as intended and that they are going to be incentivized to do what we want them to do. But what if they still continue to wake up early and just do other stuff? Or, as other people said, what if they stay up later instead so that they are waking up later in the day, but they're not getting more sleep overall? That could be a problem as well. So, anytime there's an incentive program, you always want to ask, is it incentivizing what we want, or could it be incentivizing some other behavior? And then what this the country of fake landia, I just put that to amuse myself because you know how they always have those ridiculous made up country names. So I decided let's be direct with it. Fake landia and then Cityville. So in fake landia, we're banning gasoline powered cars, so everything's gonna be great in 10 years. Fight this argument for me. Yeah, I like that idea of assuming that they can afford it. What if electric vehicles are more expensive and people can't buy them? And that, just because they're replacing their vehicles every 10 years now, does that mean they're going to continue that behavior in the future? What if they just hold on to their cars, their gas cars, for much, 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 much longer? Yeah. Anything else? Any other like behavioral change that would make this all fall apart? Ooh, Abra, I think that's actually a really good point about like the other emissions that aren't just what the car emits in the moment. But I think the scope of this argument is saying like reduction in emissions from gasoline powered vehicles. So while I think that that's a good thought in general, I think the scope of this argument is a little tighter than that. But how about this? If something is outlawed in your country, does that mean nobody ever has it? People might buy vehicles in other countries and then just drive them across the border. So we are assuming that it is a fully self-contained, happens in a vacuum. That's a really common flaw type just in general in the GMAT, is assuming things happen in a vacuum and that there are no external factors, other countries, other companies that are relevant. So we're assuming drivers will continue to replace vehicles like they did in the past, and that they won't be incentivized to do something we don't want them to do, namely go to other countries to buy their vehicles. So I just kind of wrap these up with the idea of it's assuming that human behavior is predictable and that people are going to do what we want them to do. As we know in real life, that is a wild assumption. That often does not happen. People are not always incentivized to do what we want them to do. So And yeah, I mean, Fred, I think like, yeah, the 10-year thing, it's just a way of saying like, if they replace them every 10 years, then 10 years in the future would be the bookend of we shouldn't see anymore. So sometimes you'll have arguments that like bring in those facts that didn't have to be true, but are just part of the argument. So our last pattern that we're looking at today, this idea of human behavior. If we have arguments about incentives or disincentives, like, a mayor put out this ordinance, or the, governor started this program, we're going to give people money for this, or we're going to fine them for that. You always want to ask, are people going to change their behavior the way that we want them to, or are they going to do something, out in left field that's the opposite of what we want them to do? Or like with the red sports car one, if we're looking at a scenario that involves human behavior, but the argument kind of forgets about that, like we're talking about cars, but really it's not about cars, it's about the drivers. So yeah, just assume humans are irrational, and that'll help you fight against these arguments. Okay. These are 4 that we've talked about today. There are many other patterns out there. There are many other ways that you could categorize different types of arguments. Not all of these exist in a vacuum. And as we said, you could have ones that like you could think of as correlation and causation, or you could think of as human behavior, like the kids with asthma and swimming. That could be human behavior, could be correlation, causation, could be representative sample issues. Could be lots of things all at once. So don't worry too much about exactly what box does it go in. But instead, you want to ask yourself, when you're doing new problems, can I connect the dots between this one and other ones I've seen? Are there things that are predictable about the GMAT test writers and kind of how they structure arguments and structure flaws? Because the more that you notice those similarities and those patterns, I'm sure you've noticed this as you're studying. When things feel familiar, you're like, I got this. I feel confident. I can move through it smoothly and quickly. Sometimes we've recognized that more easily on Quant, where we're like, I learned this rule. Now I can apply this rule. On verbal, you have to do that work on your own a lot of times, of reviewing problems deeply to connect the dots, connect these pieces to each other. We have 5 minutes left. I'd say let's put this to the test with one example problem before we head out. So let's try. It's an argument we've seen before. Take a look at what happens with the answer choices. So give this one a try. Oh, and I should say, when you have an answer, send it to me as a DM, not in the main chat. All right, DM me your answers if you haven't already. But we seem to be in almost complete unison here. That is great to see. So here, I just want to, for just a moment, block out the answer choices for a sec and just discuss this idea of why we've done this exercise of just deconstructing arguments, but not looking at answer choices until just now. My observation, watching thousands and thousands of students over the years, is that people tend to speed read, treat it like it's reading comp, just speed read through it and get to the answer choices as quickly as possible. That's dangerous. You're going to do best on critical reasoning if you really take your time, deconstruct the argument. In a 2-minute problem, you should be spending a minute of that deconstructing your argument, trying to break it, figure out what's wrong with it, and then know exactly what you're looking for when you look at the answer choices. So if you want to improve critical reasoning in general, that's what I would say is really take the time to deconstruct the argument, kind of push on it, then look at the answer choices. So since we don't have a ton of time, we'll just say that in this one, as we discussed, what we were looking for is the flaw in this argument was thinking that, oh, what was reported indicates what really happened. Notice that this one doesn't have that population the same. So there is also could be a number versus percentage idea. Maybe the population went up. But the thing that is logically necessary, the assumption that has to be true, is that 10 years ago, they were not less likely to report acts of violence. Because if 10 years ago, people in general were less likely to report, and now they're more likely to report, then the instance of reports doesn't actually indicate anything about how much violence there actually is. It's just about people and their reporting. We don't care what happens in other cities. We don't care about specifics of early childhood, but some different program. Number of police, this would be a mixed metric. Number of police is not directly correlated to number of acts of violence. That's switching to a different metric. And then if something had not been undertaken, something would have increased. This is hypothetical, and a hypothetical is never logically necessary. That wouldn't be something that has to be true. So that leaves us with A, that can't trust the report issue. So we will leave it here. So thank you so much for joining. I hope you'll sign up for more of these free webinars in the future. We really like to give you the opportunity to get some advice from our experts for free, and I hope that you found it helpful. We offer, of course, live classes in addition to our self-study course. So if you are interested in that, please let us know. We would love to see you in one of our classes. And thank you for being so engaged. You guys were so sharp, had such great responses, great ideas. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and good luck with your studies. Take care.